It's like a gigantic, like Lollapalooza thing. It's like blocks of the city. It's amazing.
Actually, a look over.
No, they draw the view, but there is amazing.
It's very good. The food's very good.
I was gonna say, insanely good. Like, I have pictures. The best sashimi in the world.
The thing is that you can look at a place on the outside, and like, this place looks like a dump. Like this is not a good place, and you go in and it's
No, I was like, it was obscene. Like, cocktails too.
So
that's it's a great city.
You need to get pens.
Give me 1 second. I got an email. I know. I was in a conference. I want to.
That's what I figured.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if you were on leave or something.
No, not really. Just like trying to conference and teach and so on. But I was like, and also like when I have an email like that, like I want to sit down and next there. It's not like
That's what I was thinking.
yeah. But
Yeah, good to see you, man. I thought you were on sabbatical.
We all wait.
Is this in the front?
Yeah. No, I was last year. We back.
Take care.
Thanks, man. Let's see. What time is
Also,
it?
trying to catch up.
I'm
Well,
glad
minutes.
American national government.
Yeah. You're coming from the branch.
You've got reading. We're it's a heavy reading. He seems to think that actually
Disappointment, Scott.
I'm already
So disappointed.
A&G.
We just check here. Just to confirm, you're coming from here.
I will be.
Awesome.
So then this new level.
Sounds good. Awesome.
Yeah, it is. I imagine
People are coming.
because he has the American Auditorium. So we've got 20.
We're very excited to have our speaker today, John C. Davis, presenting his book From Blue to Red, The Rise of the GOP in Arkansas. This came out like 2 years ago, yeah.
I think it was in 24.
24, yeah, so it's still pretty new. We're gonna discuss politics in Arkansas. Oh, it's an easy topic. We'll begin. I'm just gonna read the bio that John has here. So John C. Davis is the Executive Director of the David and Barbara Pryor Center for Arkansas Oral and Visual History and Associate Teaching Professor of Political Science at the University of Arkansas. An eighth-generation Arkansan, Davis lives with his family in Fayetteville. That's a short and great
I thought you'd like that.
Yeah. John, take it away.
Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Lyon College, and they've been wonderful hosts. Just a point of personal privilege. I have family ties that are really quite deep in Batesville. And in fact, on a run this morning, I was running around campus. We moved from Batesville 30 years ago this summer. But the house next to the president's house, which I don't know if anyone's been here long enough, was Anne Crutchfield's home. We lived there for a couple of years, and so it was really fun to see that. We walked our dogs at Lyon College. We were here during the switch from Arkansas to Lyon College. I went to the Scottish games, soccer matches. Y'all didn't have football then, but we went to everything else, basketball camps, baseball camps, you name it. So in a lot of ways, this is a homecoming, and it's a real honor and privilege to be here today.
Now, was your daddy or your granddad sheriff? Is that
Yes, my grandfather, John Conway Davis, was sheriff in the 60s, the late 50s into late 60s. And my parents were bankers here. My father was with a bank called the Community Bank down on Main at the time. And we were here until summer of 1996. So my grandfather, I still have family here right now. So it's a lot of fun to come back. So I really appreciate y'all giving me the excuse, right? The reason to come back and get to relive some wonderful, wonderful memories in your really particularly lovely small hometown, Batesville. I think Skip Rutherford says it's America's best hometown. And Skip's a smart man, so I know better than to question it. So thank you all for being here. So the book is titled From Blue to Red, The Rise of the GOP in Arkansas. And what I want to do is introduce sort of highlights and main ideas about the book. And I'm hoping we can kind of set this up like I teach, where you feel free to interrupt anytime. And then I'll also try to keep it snappy enough to where no one visibly falls asleep, where everyone can see it, mainly me, because it would just crush me. But also we can have Q&A at the end, right? So I'll try to keep it about 40 or so minutes, give or take a little bit. But I would love to have discussion and Q&A. If you're interested in getting a copy of the book, there are some copies over here back behind Mr. Sturch, and I'm happy to sign anything if you'd like. I will say, if you look, there's some little QR codes. My wife is far more tech savvy than I am. And so if you purchase it through an app, it'll go to her account. And so that'll be fine. But you'll see a name that's not mine. Don't be alarmed when you're giving that person money. I promise you it's her money, even if you gave it to me. So we'll get started. I started this project in the late 20-teens. I had come back to Arkansas. I was a professor at UA Monticello and had a wonderful opportunity, in addition to teaching and writing and political science there, to become the Director of Governmental Relations. And that afforded me, I think, a unique opportunity to sort of see some of this shift in a different lens, a slightly different perspective than I would have purely as an academic. So I was curious about the change. I'd grown up, of course, in Arkansas. I had been away. We left in 2011 for grad school at the University of Missouri, and then I had the good fortune of coming back to my home state as a faculty member. And for faculty in this room, that doesn't always happen the way that you want it to. I'm now at my alma mater, University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, and that doesn't happen barely ever. So I feel really doubly fortunate in this endeavor. But that position at UAM afforded me an opportunity to sort of see this with sort of one foot into the General Assembly, looking around and working with some wonderful committed legislators and other public officials, and then also from an academic perspective, with a real keen interest in Southern politics, political parties, and Arkansas politics. And so all this sort of met perfectly. I also had an opportunity to interview 20, I would say, key figures or key observers of this partisan change in Arkansas during this project. And that wouldn't have happened
in the way that it did without the support, financial support, of the David and Barbara Pryor Center for Arkansas Oral and Visual History, which at the time I did not work with or work for. So now I get to lead a wonderful team of oral historians committed to collecting, preserving, and sharing Arkansas history. But at this time, that was not even a dream. But I'm always quick to point out that even before I worked there, the Pryor Center was a lovely resource for me and can possibly a resource for future researchers on topics related to Arkansas. I break the idea of the evolution, if you will, of the GOP and sort of its modern form in Arkansas and its prominence in Arkansas into three groups. That's what most of us do, right? Most researchers, we try to sort of, at least political scientists, try to put things in boxes. Sometimes they fit and sometimes they don't. I will say I don't think they fit perfectly, but I do find, and I use the term generations, but it could be phases or stages. I've heard different forms of that, and I think that makes sense too. In each of these generations or time periods, we see events that either in the moment or in hindsight were significant historically to where the Republican Party is today, and also where the Democratic Party is today in Arkansas, which I think we've, one of the reasons for this book was that not only am I a shameless homer that just really wants to focus on Arkansas stuff, but I also think it was significant in that Arkansas had rather stubbornly held on to its Democratic past, its Democratic ties and loyalties for a considerably long time, especially if you compare us to other southern states. And when it changed, from an outside perspective, it was seemingly overnight. It seemed to occur to a great many people in 2010. 2010 happened, and poof, it just happened. And as someone who is interested in studying political parties, and I have a real interest in party organizations and how really committed people do the real grunt work, if you will, of organizing parties and organizing county central committees and fundraising and reaching out and recruiting talented candidates and building, to use a sports analogy, a deep bench for your politics. I knew that narrative didn't really make sense to me anyway, that 2010 you just wake up one day and it all happened. But quite literally, if you woke up on Election Day 2010, Arkansas has 4 House members, right? 3 out of the 4 were Democrats. Both senators were Democrats. Your constitutional officers in the state legislature were Democrats. Your majority in the House and in the Senate, in the General Assembly, were Democrats. That's 2010. It wasn't that long ago. I notice every year I say that, my students find that it is a little longer than it seems to me. But it was not that long ago. And in 2 election cycles, everything changes. And I would say really, and there's people in this room that would kind of get what I'm talking about here. If we had all of our Senate seats in the State General Assembly up for re-election every 2 years instead of staggering them, I think it probably could have happened in 1 election cycle. Okay, this rather dramatic shift. We're in a position now where we just concluded our primary elections, and for the overwhelming majority, and as I'm saying that, I'm hedging because I really can't think of a terribly competitive Democratic primary in the state of Arkansas that happened this week. I really can't. I'm not saying there isn't one out there somewhere. But most of the races we focused on the most were on the Republican side, right? More Arkansans have been voting in the GOP primaries since 2014 than Democratic primaries, okay? But still not that long ago. Wasn't that long ago at all. If you were an up-and-coming, publicly inspired public servant, really eager to get elected and serve Arkansans or serve folks in your community, and you were running for a partisan race in most places in the state, right? Someone's going to counsel you and say, you need to run as a Democrat, right? You're going to hop into that crowded primary, and if you survive that, the general election's a cakewalk, okay? The shoe's on the other foot today, by and large. We're in a very different political space, too, and we'll talk about that later. But the first generation is only about about 2 decades after V.O. Key. Some of you may know of him, some of you may not. He was a political scientist that was most prominent in the 40s and 50s. And he wrote a book on Southern politics, where every chapter is devoted to a state in the former Confederacy. And with Arkansas, he points out a few things that really stuck out to me. One is he said it was such a one-party dominated state that it was a no-party state. 2, he said it was a one-party state, perhaps in its most undefiled form. So comparing all other states in the Union, particularly the southern states, which if you remember back in that era, all tilted heavily Democratic. He said of all of those, this was the state. Arkansas was the state with the least competitive elections. They were issueless campaigns, he would say. They were based on more loyalty and not really ideological in any sense of the term. They were based on relationships, retail politics, feuds, pretty colorful snapshot of Arkansas politics in that era. We get to 66 and we have a significant figure that we'll get back to here in a minute. Does anybody know who that would be in 66 for Republican politics? Winthrop Rockefeller, right? He had already become a figure in the party. He had amassed inherited a considerable fortune. His family, the Rockefellers, moves to the state in the 50s, and pretty quickly begins a strong campaign advocating for two parties, a competitive party system in Arkansas. He thought that was one of the things that ailed us, was that we didn't have two parties competing for ideas. And Orville Faubus tried to kind of keep him close and was able to do that for quite some time. And then in 66, we have a historical moment where Winthrop Rockefeller, the first Republican since Reconstruction, is elected governor. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. What happens in 92 in Arkansas? Bill Clinton's elected, in a sense, to the White House, right? So I lived in Batesville at the time, and you think about it, 92 to 96 was when we moved. You had former governor of Arkansas in the White House. You had, remember the TV show Evening Shade? Okay. You had Designing Women. The house was the historic home in Little Rock. I remember that. And then you had, of course, the Arkansas Razorbacks and Nolan Richardson and 40 Minutes of Hell. The world revolved around Arkansas to this kid, right? But 1992 was both a historic point of excitement, historically significant to everybody in the state, particularly exciting and historical for Democrats in the state, but it also provides some huge opportunities that we may not have seen in the moment, we see in hindsight for the Republicans. We'll talk about that later. We then see the 93 to 2010 phase, and this is really where I think a lot of events happen. Some are accidental, but even the accidental events that occur that turn out to be really wonderful, game-changing events for Republicans were really only capitalized fully because of people on the ground in the Republican Party that were willing to catch lightning in a bottle, right? There are several moments in the second, and then certainly in our current generation where, it could have gone another way. Republicans could have had a really good election cycle. They had those before, and then dropped the ball 2 years later. But they really don't. Once they get into the second generation, once you start to see a party being built, it begins to be built really from the bottom up, and then it captures this moment of nationalized politics, very top-down narrative from 24/7 news and social media, and really also the unpopularity of then President Barack Obama. All that stuff's top-down. But in order to capitalize on this and really make big gains and make them last, right, make these majorities that they have endure, they had to already have people on the ground that were willing to recruit and train potentially talented elected officials. And that's something that Democrats had never really had to do. But Republicans had to spend years doing that, I argue, before they got to where they are today. So some of it's accidental, some of it's completely out of their control. But what was in their control was the ability to seize the moment and to take advantage of it. So just a quick review. The first generation we have Winthrop Rockefeller. He's elected in 66. Y'all will remember 2-year terms for governors during this era. We almost gave everybody two-year terms for governor, right? There were no term limits was the trade-off. So a governor had one legislative session. They took office, and then they hit the ground running. For Winthrop Rockefeller, that was a real struggle. Winthrop Rockefeller is playing, legislative politics with a recalcitrant, pretty angry, really, Democratic majority in both the House and the Senate. They don't like working with him. They may not like him, or they might like him personally. It wasn't really the thing, but the idea of having a Republican in that office made things challenging for the Democrats, but even more challenging for Winthrop Rockefeller. Winthrop Rockefeller is I think, properly given credit not so much for things that passed on his watch, but things that he began discussions on that later were passed, particularly by Governors Bumper and Pryor. In fact, both of those gentlemen would give Winthrop Rockefeller a lot of credit later on for a lot of the reforms that we saw in the 60s and 70s in Arkansas. And really, particularly in the 70s, we see all kinds of institutional reforms that occur in our state, in Arkansas. So Rockefeller deserves a lot of credit. The thing with Rockefeller is he's reelected in 68, and then he falls from political grace. He loses his reelection bid in 70, and then many of us know he passes away very, very quickly after that. He was with cancer. So his political rise was built largely on himself, his connection with people, his personal wealth in building a Republican Party that was literally in his office for part of the duration of the time that he was investing his own richness, his own riches to his party. And when he leaves the party, there's really no coattail, so to speak. No one's really there to pick up the Winthrop Rockefeller mantle in any real meaningful sense of the term. You might know the name John Paul Hammerschmidt. You know, Congressman Hammerschmidt has a very long career in D.C. as a U.S. House member in Arkansas. He's a Republican from Harrison, builds a really impressive congressional career. He's really the only person that comes out of that mid-60s election rush with Winthrop Rockefeller who has considerable time in office after that, okay? But he was really kind of a quiet public official. We really don't probably give him his due, but he was running at the same time as Rockefeller. He was just as equally involved, maybe not financially, but just as equally involved in party leadership in the Republican ranks in those years leading up to the mid-60s. We also see that the national brands of the parties begin to sort themselves. So in political science, we'll talk about party sorting. Gone are the days of conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. Doesn't exist anymore. Winthrop Rockefeller would have a hard time running as a Republican today. He would have a hard time running as a Democrat today too, okay? And I think that could be said for a great many of our elected officials in the past. They would have had a hard time fitting in this new sorted electorate where if we're liberal, if we identify as liberal, we identify as Democrats. If we're Republican, we identify as conservative. And I think we can all agree, whether we like it or not, the distance seemingly between the people we elect on both sides are somewhere around my arms, even though most of us are probably somewhere around my shoulders in between, okay? Which is probably for another book and another book talk. But it starts in the 60s, okay? In the 1960s, you start to see split ticket voting. And in Arkansas, what does that mean? It means that we like Richard Nixon. Before him, we liked not a majority, and I like to say that, but a plurality of us in a very confusing era had a moment, and we liked George Wallace. But we also liked Winthrop Rockefeller, and we also liked J. William Fulbright. So I don't know, go figure there. But that was the beginning of us shifting away from national Democratic Party politics. You take out LBJ, you take out Jimmy Carter, you take out Bill Clinton, and we have not, as a state, majority of us have not selected the Democratic nominee for President of the United States since 1960. It's been a long time coming, okay? So that split ticket voting meant that Arkansas voters had to sort of remove themselves from their old straight ticket party ways, right? It also meant we were sort of rejecting whatever we thought was going on in national politics while still adhering and really staying pretty loyal to the people we knew, our incumbents, in congressional offices down to local seats, with some exceptions. We see that occasionally there was a Jim Rankino. Some of you may know that name. Jim Rankino was a OBU political science professor. He passed away relatively young, actually on an election night, doing election night coverage at Channel 7. But he had a great book on the election of 68 and really kind of talking about 1970 as well in Arkansas politics. And he paints a really pretty accurate picture. He says, the Republicans can win when Democrats screw up. That's about it, okay? With some exceptions of some key pockets, Democrats have to make a misstep, create an opportunity for Republicans. I'm an incumbent House member. but I'm really ambitious. I'm a Democrat. I'm really ambitious. I want to run for I want to run for that Senate seat. So I'm going to challenge that senator, that incumbent who's also a Democrat, and I'm going to lose. Okay, and that creates a vacancy in my House seat, and then up pops, say, an Ed Bethune or somebody like that. Okay, a Republican. I'm talking about Jim Guy Tucker. Okay, Jim Guy Tucker up and running, and he's a young man in a hurry, and he makes a miscalculation. It happens. Okay, so that's what Jim Rankino is talking about. Clinton in 1980, right? Clinton in 1980 loses to Frank White, and I don't think anyone was more surprised than Frank White. Frank White, who I would have loved to have gotten to meet or gotten to know, was this really smart but very affable, relatable guy. And my favorite story of Frank White, and I don't know if this really happened, but I love the story. He would tell people that shortly after his election in 1980, he and Mrs. White are walking down Central Avenue in Hot Springs, and someone says, "Hey, there's the governor." And he goes, "Where?" Frank White has one term, okay? He gets, in a lot of the same ways as Rockefeller, he's running headlong into supermajorities of entrenched Democratic incumbent legislators. He also gets caught up in nothing scandalous, but he gets caught up in perhaps signing some bills without full appreciation for the aftermath of these bills. One most notably is our version of what you might consider the Scopes monkey trial. Occurs when there's a creationism bill that's passed, and he signs, and then later he's asked about it because going into a court case, it looks like it's going to be struck down and ruled unconstitutional. And Frank White says something to the effect of, "Well, I didn't read it," which kind of played into a stereotype that we were already developing for Frank White, right? Fairly or not. And so Frank White runs again in '82. Bill Clinton has spent the last 2 years apologizing for everything he had done in his first term. Goes on an apology tour. "I'm sorry," and he wins in '82, right? We sort of taught him a lesson, right, and put him back in office. And Frank White, who still remains a prominent Arkansan for years, but no longer is governor of Arkansas after that. We have some interesting races also. The 1990 GOP primary. I think I like talking about this more than most people like hearing about it, so I'll spare you a little bit. But I don't know who, I won't ask a show of hands. I don't want to shame anybody, but hopefully you voted in the primary. Hopefully you did just recently. And you may have noticed that if you're a registered Republican, it didn't affect you. You could vote in the Republican primary. If you are an independent or unaffiliated, you could vote in the Republican primary. If you were a registered Democrat and you wanted a Republican ballot this time, you couldn't do that. You have to switch your affiliation. It was a pretty painless process for people, but it's a little different. We're accustomed to open primaries in Arkansas, okay? For a long time, we've been doing it that way until recently. 90 is maybe the one example where I think there's an argument, and I don't know that it holds statistical, I don't know if it would really hold water, but the argument has always been that Lee Atwater, does anybody remember the name Lee Atwater? Who really is sort of one of the architects of the Republican Party in the 80s and 90s. He dies at a pretty young age in the early 90s. But the story goes that in the late 80s, George H.W. Bush is growing more confident that he's going to have, especially into 91, that he's going to have a successful reelection bid. And Lee Atwater is scared to death of him losing. And he argues he could only lose to one guy. He can lose to this governor in Arkansas. He thought Bill Clinton was the perfect mismatch, right, for President Bush. We actually saw that play out if we think back. Lee Atwater saw it before probably anybody else, maybe even before Bill Clinton did, frankly. Lee Atwater, with President Bush, recruits Tommy Robinson, who was a House member previously, to switch parties. And you might even remember, you can still dig around and find it on C-SPAN, where he gives this just barn-burning speech about everything that's wrong with the Democratic Party and why he's switching parties. Now, he's also probably leaving Congress because of a check-kiting scheme that was going to hit him and others pretty hard. But he leaves, comes back to the state. Lee Atwater meets with the Stevens brothers, and they decide to fund Tommy Robinson's primary campaign in the GOP. And you might say, why did Lee Atwater care about Tommy Robinson running in the state of Arkansas? Well, according to Lee Atwater, and I won't use the language Lee Atwater used, he said, I don't give an F about Arkansas, but I don't want that governor to be beatable, or to be able to beat Bush in 92. So Lee Atwater's, I think, if we parse the words, he thinks Tommy Robinson can really beat him up. He may not even win, but he's thinking if Tommy can get through the primary and then have a general election where he has months to just pummel verbally, but maybe also literally, Tommy had a temper, could just go after Bill Clinton for months, that he would come out of that election in 90 vulnerable and might not really be seen as a suitable nominee for the Democrats in 92. Lee Atwater was a smart guy, right? He was playing chess where everybody else was playing checkers. Sheffield Nelson was kind of the standard Republican candidate in this. He was the traditional Republican in this. He was co-chairing the Republican Party of Arkansas with Asa Hutchinson at the time. Sheffield Nelson had been a wildly successful story in Arkansas, sort of a rags to riches story, a real Arkansas success story. And he was going to run a campaign that was a pretty traditional one, and that was kind of seen ahead of time. So the story is that the Democratic Party of Arkansas, and I would say this if he were in the room, Skip Rutherford, I think Skip Rutherford, and I think a couple columnists in the state newspapers encourage people to, if you're a Democrat, to go vote in the Republican primary and vote for Sheffield Nelson. Because Democrats were worried about Tommy Robinson too. He was volatile. He was unpredictable. You didn't know what he was going to do. And he could tap into a populist streak that Arkansans have had for generations, and he knew it. I would argue that Tommy Robinson, in many ways, appeals to Arkansas voters in the same way that Donald Trump has appealed to Arkansas voters, okay? So Tommy Robinson could have, I think, been a pretty dangerous opponent against Bill Clinton in 1990. I don't think he would have held back. Okay, Sheffield Nelson ends up winning. And it's true, if you look at the map, there's some places, particularly in Little Rock, that got all Republican all of a sudden for that one primary and then weren't Republican again. There are these, if you look down at the precincts, you do see some areas. If you look at places where Tommy Robinson won, he did really well, particularly in rural areas in Arkansas. I can't say that he won more counties than Nelson because I don't quite remember offhand, but I promise you he won, if we were talking land mass and not people, I know he would have won that, right? He was broadly popular. He was just not popular in Northwest Arkansas, where really that had been the kind of old guard Republican stronghold, and Central Arkansas and some of the places where we had bigger populations. Long story short, Sheffield Nelson wins the primary and then loses to Bill Clinton, right? Who spent most of the time campaigning saying he's not going to run for president in 1992, right? And then in 92, Governor Clinton, of course, October of 91 announces his run for President of the United States, and of course, November of 1992, he's elected. He takes office in January of 93. This creates a musical chairs effect. We have Jim Guy Tucker move to governor, okay? And then we have an open seat for lieutenant governor, right? We have an open special election, an unusual calendar election. And we have, we'll actually hear from Asa Hutchinson and Mike Huckabee here in a minute about the aftermath of that and the effect that it had on Arkansas politics. And I would argue that was completely happenstance, right? That wasn't something you could plan. But what they could control, Republicans controlled very well in that scenario. And then the second generation, we're looking at the beginning of term limits in Arkansas. So in 1992, we introduced the strictest term limits in the country for state legislators. In fact, if y'all remember, we even tried to introduce term limits to our members of Congress, and the Supreme Court's like, calm down. You can't do that. We don't care what you do with your state legislators, but you can't do that. There's a court case about that that comes out in a few years later. We have open seat elections. All these things favor the party out of power. Okay, they absolutely do. If you look at people who were campaigning for term limits, there were Republicans, and then kind of reform-minded folks. But Republicans knew that this would potentially benefit them as the party out of power in the 1990s. I will just throw this out there to be fair for everybody. If you remember, more recently, we have made term limits very weak, okay, relative to how they were. And do we remember the party that was in favor of weakening them? The party in power. Who was the party in power? The Republicans were in power at this point, right? So it's a strategic move with a lot of, kind of good government, reform-minded arguments as well for and against term limits. But I want to offend everybody equally when we talk about two-party politics. We then have a really key institutional change that I want to talk about too, and here in a minute you'll hear Asa Hutchinson speak on it. So I'm going to let Asa Hutchinson explain the effect that open seat elections had on Republicans.
He goes on further in our interview to discuss,
even Mike Huckabee is a name in early 1993 only because he had just campaigned against and lost against Dale Bumpers, right? I mean, going up against Dale Bumpers would be really hard. Asa Hutchinson knew that. Asa Hutchinson had gone up against Dale Bumpers in 1986 and lost. Mike Huckabee didn't come terribly close in that election, but was relatively close to historical terms, right? He had just run a statewide race, and that mattered a great deal. We'll get to, I thought I had it on here. We'll get to the discussion. If it's not the next slide, next clip, I'll fill you in, but Asa Hutchinson had a story. Let's see, it might even be, let me see if I can fast forward a bit. Yeah, here we go. Huckabee's loss. So if you caught that right, Mike Huckabee had just run a brutal campaign, really hard. We worked really hard on this campaign. He had pneumonia and symptoms related to exhaustion. He's in the hospital, and Asa Hutchinson, who's the chairman of the Republican Party of Arkansas, according to Asa, calls him. According to Huckabee, goes to his bedside and says, "Hey, suck it up. You need to run again, like now, like yesterday. What you need, And if you notice, even Asa had a little smirk when he was talking about how, I think he recalls this being probably kind of a tough call to make, right? It's hard you want to give the guy a break, give him a little bit of time to rest. Huckabee goes on to win that special election as lieutenant governor. He's running against Nate Coulter. Nate Coulter, who is now the director of Central Arkansas Library System, but at that point was kind of seen as a young, kind of up-and-coming Democrat in the vein of Bill Clinton and Jim Guy Tucker. Either wasn't well known outside of those circles or suffered from sort of a post-election malaise that may have happened in Arkansas. But either way, Mike Huckabee had built a name, a brand, or was on his way to doing so in this failed 1992 election, and does really surprisingly well in the special election, which puts him in a seat. Now, under most circumstances, I ask my students this: what's the job of the lieutenant governor? You gavel in, right? And then you have a pulse, okay? Not to make a lot of it. But you're there in case. Jim Guy Tucker ran for lieutenant governor in '90 because he figured Bill Clinton would be running, right, for president. And this was his shot at maybe getting to be governor. Mike Huckabee probably didn't have any expectations of becoming governor. He likely was eyeing a Senate seat in the future. And things go sideways for Jim Guy Tucker. And by summer of 1996, Mike Huckabee's, governor of Arkansas. It's only the second governor of Arkansas who's a Republican since Reconstruction. I got to talk to now Ambassador Huckabee about this, and I asked him not so much what all he's most proud of as far as the state. You think about it, he was in there over a decade because of the way that he had assumed the position, and then he was elected and reelected on his own right. And he had challenges working with Democrats. There were all kinds of issues and challenges. He was getting sort of outflanked by more ardent conservatives as well that were saying he wasn't going too far, or too far enough. He should have held the line more. And so we had a really good talk. But I asked him what is he most proud of from being governor in regards to his party. Okay, what did he do for his party? And this is what he said. By the way, Mike Huckabee can pull off a shirt-jacket combo that I can't. So Huckabee, if you think about it, the governor of Arkansas appoints, it's a massive number. It's changed a little over time. It's a massive number of Arkansans to positions in varying levels of, I would say sort of political connectedness, right? There's some that we're more aware of, like the Highway Commission, Game and Fish Commission. And then there's some that are lesser known, but are just as important in their own right. And what he's saying is having the ability to really, what he's talking about is building a bench, right? He might have somebody who has been split ticket voting for years. Maybe they vote for Republican candidates for president, but they're really lower ticket. Maybe they lean Democratic. They're more moderate to conservative, but they're still voting for Democratic elected officials in Arkansas. They get on a commission, they work with him, they work with perhaps maybe even a few other Republicans in his administration, probably more closely with them than him in these boards and commission positions. And after a while, you have cultivated a base. You now have somebody who has a different perspective on state government and politics. They've been able to network and meet some really interesting people across the state. And these are people that can go back home, and while they've never held public office, or they've not held maybe the public office they're going to seek, they do have a bigger toolbox or bigger kit in their toolbox, so to speak, to run for office. So he was able to build talent by doing that. The one thing that we noticed, though, about Mike Huckabee, and it's no dig on him, and maybe it was sort of the way that he came into office, if we look at people who were active in Republican Party politics and those who held office in Republican spaces, whether it's in the party level or if it was even in the state level, almost all of them, it's like the Kevin Bacon game. They almost, of a certain age, they've got a connection to his administration over 10 years. What we don't, and that's very important, right? And that's what he's touching on. What we don't see, if you look, is there's not a real groundswell of support, like a wake, behind Mike Huckabee. We use political coattails as a reference, right? Which must be an old reference because I don't think anybody wears tails anymore. But the idea was that people could kind of ride in his wake, right, and kind of get into a position. There weren't a lot of those stories in Arkansas. You can point to a few races that were, more competitive, and certainly Mike Huckabee did well in his own electoral politics. But when he leaves office in January of '07, we're still very much a democratically controlled state, okay? And so people can, talk about why this is. I argue in the book that the fact that Clinton's not in the state was probably a good thing for the Democrats. The President of the United States is the de facto head of his party, right? So President Trump is really the symbolic head of the Republican Party right now, nationally, okay? Bill Clinton was the symbolic head of the Democratic Party in the 1990s. And even though Arkansans were, pretty polarized on Bill Clinton in the 1990s, it's hard to have him painted as some sort of out-of-touch, person had no clue what it's like to be in the South or in a rural state or in Arkansas. That's hard to market, right? You knew of him. Even if you didn't like him, you knew of him. And there might be a list of grievances, but those really don't stick well, okay? And so Asa Hutchinson had even talked to me about how when he was Republican Party chairman in the early 90s, and some of those were early Clinton administration years, he had a really hard time tying the National Democratic Party to the state Democratic Party. He couldn't get them aligned. He knew if he could do that majority of Arkansas voters, which are more moderate to conservative, would be aghast at the national politics of the Democrats and would reject even the local level folks. He knew that. But he could never really, while he was chair, convince people that was so. We always operate in these separate spaces here. And I think Clinton helped a little bit with that. Also, if we think back, for a lot of the Bush years, George W. Bush years, we had John Bozeman as a House member, and then you had 3 other Democrats. And those Democrats were not really considered great Democrats on a national level, right? They remember the term blue dog Democrats? They were fiscal hawk Democrats. They were socially moderate, you might say. They were pretty careful on guns and other social issues. They tried to do what Dale Bumpers and David Pryor had done really successfully, which is really stay in tune with Arkansans in a way that even if their views were maybe more liberal or more progressive, they would typically stay close enough to the overall majority of voters in Arkansas to not lose them, to not break trust. And those House members were trying their darndest to do that in the 2000s. And in really looking back, they were, for the most part, supporting what was at the time the most polarizing issue, which was likely the war in Iraq. They're more likely to continue to reauthorize that. There was those key issues where they really were able to kind of, I think, use Bush in a way where it was really hard for voters. Now, if you wanted to vote for Republican candidates, that was fine, but it was going to be really hard for you to see a significant difference between the two. And I got to interview Tim Griffin for this project, and one thing he said was, the key to electoral politics to him is separating yourself from your opponent, right? And then making it clear the separation. And it's harder to do, even in the Bush years, with pretty moderate, you could even say on some issues, conservative Democrats, right? Now, in today's jargon, they'd be dinos in the world of rhinos and dinos, right? But in Arkansas, we're talking about, Lincoln, we're talking about Mark Pryor, we're talking about Ross, we're talking about Marion Barry, we're talking about people who were not known as sort of more of a left-wing politics. It was a very, very localized politics. And then the other thing I mentioned in the book is that Diane Blair, who you all might have heard of, she passed away around late 90s, early 2000. She wrote a book, the first edition of Arkansas Politics, in the 80s. And she writes a publication in the 90s, and then this little argument comes into her second edition with Jay Barth. And in it, she says, one of the reasons why Arkansas had stayed Democratic, even as the rest of the South had turned Republican, was that we had uniquely qualified, charismatic, retail politic-oriented elected officials who were Democrats. Okay, it wasn't that they were Democrats; it was that all those other things and they were Democrats, right? And the big three, as she called it, were Bumpers, Pryor, and Clinton. Okay, and these were people who, had never missed a pie supper. They always went to the Peak Tomato Festival. They would go to the White River Water Carnival. They'd go to the Coon Suppers. They did all these things, and they knew it mattered. And I'm confident that at least two, maybe all three of them genuinely love doing that too. And it would show. People, we're pretty smart. We can catch if someone's faking it. They didn't seem to fake it. I would add BB into that. Okay, I would say BB's kind of your final bridge. Okay, Mike BB from Searcy, never ran in a contested election until Asa Hutchinson in 2006. Okay, and Asa Hutchinson in 2006, in hindsight, probably needed more time, sort of back in the state. He had been gone and had some really important roles in the federal government under the Bush administration. And also, Mike BB was just incredibly hard to beat. No one really knew how he would face an opponent. He had not had one. But in 2006, and then again in 2010, he does exceptionally well. In 2006, he's kind of playing with house money. The Democrats are really still doing well in the state. There's a national backlash against Republican politics, midterm election kind of stuff that happens when you're the party in power. And so that's not going to hurt Mike Beebe in 2006. But I think the most telling thing about Beebe is in 2010. Does anybody remember how many counties Mike Beebe wins in 2010? Mike Beebe, a Democrat, in the 2010 election. Anybody want to guess?
Every single one.
All 75 counties. That's astounding to me. It really is. It wasn't the margin. The margin was pretty big too, but it wasn't the margin. To me, it was the spread. It was the ability of winning all 75 counties in a really bad year for Democrats in 2010. Really bad. I think the example to show the challenge that Mike Beebe faced is Shane Broadway. You know Shane Broadway. Okay, Shane is running for lieutenant governor in that cycle, and he loses. And if he loses, you know, you would think everybody's going to lose in the statewide race. That's a bad election year for his party, for Democrats. He loses to Mark Darr, who kind of came out of nowhere. He sort of rode in on that wave of candidates that were filing, were very passionate, and particularly speaking out against sort of the national politics of the day. And he beats Shane Broadway. It's not even really that close, if I remember correctly, the margins. Mark Darr goes on, and he has to resign from office, and all this, some stuff happens. But he's a political unknown, right? Which I guess in that case was a strength for him against Shane Broadway. But Beebe goes on to win every county. It's amazing. So I would give him some credit too. I think he's part of why Arkansas is one of the last states to shift of its neighbors. Anybody heard the name Hal Holbrook? So I loved his Mark Twain speech. He would do the evening with Mark Twain, or Mark Twain presents. Hal Holbrook had a joke. I think he would say it as if Mark Twain said it, and I don't think he did. The joke was that if he knows the world's about to end, he hopes and prays he's in Arkansas when it happens, because everything happens in Arkansas a decade later. Pretty good, right? And it seemed to be true with our partisan shift as well. So in 2008, the Republican Party falls short of recruiting someone to run against Mark Pryor. So Mark Pryor is running for re-election in 2008, and he has so much steam ahead, as does his party in Arkansas, that the Republican Party doesn't file a candidate against him, which is pretty similar to what we see now from Democrats, right, with filing against, especially in statewide elections. The Democrats seem to really struggle with this anymore. That's where we were in 2008. It was a significant difference. Obama's elected, and really from the jump, we see rising unpopularity for President Obama and his policies, not just in Arkansas, but in any state, really, that resembles the demographics or the politics of Arkansas. It's almost instant. And certainly by 2009, after the first year, going into 2010. And so I asked Jay Barth why. And some of you may know Jay or know of Jay. I think what I really appreciate about Jay's remarks is that it's not this simplified narrative, which I think most of us have probably heard, and maybe some of us agree or disagree, but I've always had a problem with this idea, well, white Arkansans didn't want to vote for Democrats anymore because the president was black. And what Jay's, I think, trying to do is go a little deeper, that he really becomes the image of the party, and it's not just his race, right? It's all the other factors. If we think about presidents prior to Obama, even if they were maybe not the most popular candidates on one of the party's major parties' ticket, I mean, you're thinking about, let's go with Carter, let's go with Reagan, let's go with even H.W., who would try to kind of play up the Texas connection as much as he could, Clinton, Al Gore in 2000, certainly George W. Bush in 2000, where he's just all Texas all the time. These are all people that if we try, they're relatable. I mean, even if we don't agree with their politics, there's something about them. I mean, Al Gore was from Tennessee, right? So it's all relatable. And I think what Jay's trying to speak to is that there's this multifaceted part of Barack Obama, and almost no piece fits. And it's not just in Arkansas. We see this happen in a lot of places. We start to see, too, that independent voters in Arkansas, and we had always considered ourselves independents, even when we were an incredibly Democratic Party state. We can go far back into some of the earlier polling in Arkansas and say the 1960s, and we would see that about a third of us would say we were independent voters. We're probably lying, but we say that anyway, right, in the 1960s. But I think even talking about that 68 election, right, we've got Winthrop Rockefeller, Republican, George Wallace, and then we've got J. William Fulbright. That's a weird bag of people. And different electorates electing these people. You think back, one's in a primary, one's later on. It gets a little confused. And George Wallace in 68, if you remember, is running as sort of a third-party candidate. So there's a lot going on there. But it does speak to this independent streak that we have. And I think, in the split-ticket voting era, we had it as well, and the label kind of worked. What we found, though, is that those who remained in that independent category over the 2000s into the 2010s to today are heavily lean Republican. We'll get into that here in a little bit more detail. Also, the nationalization of politics. So Tip O'Neill famously said, all politics is local. And I don't think it is. I would like it to be. I'll be honest. I really would. As such a state homer that I am, I would love to see our state and local politics be hyper-focused on state and local issues. And my gut tells me that most elected officials at the state and local level, Democrat or Republican, right, would prefer that. But in our current media landscape, our media diet is very national heavy, okay? Even with the Democrat Gazette, which we've got a great statewide paper. I don't know if we think about this enough. For a small state, we're really fortunate to have a daily paper like that. And many, you got the Batesville Guard here. There's many local community daily or weekly still in Arkansas, and that's wonderful. And it really, frankly, it butts against the trend that we're seeing nationally. So it's very good stuff. But our constant, connection to our devices and cable news, right, has shifted the discussion. And so I asked Bill Vickery. I don't know if any of you know Bill. Bill Vickery's a longtime political consultant, Republican political consultant, and media consultant who I felt had some really good remarks on this. we'll have John Brummett talk about that last part in a little bit greater detail. Bill's getting at this nationalized dynamic, right, in our politics. I know people who have run for quorum court positions that are asked, and some of them are Republicans, some of them are Democrats, that have been asked very national focused issues. They go knock on doors and they get asked questions that they're really not prepared to discuss, and they don't really want to discuss because they don't, it's almost like a kind of a hide game, right? It's like there's a coin behind one of my hands if you choose the right one, right? And so they're trying to sort of finesse this, and the whole time they're walking away thinking, well, golly, all I want to talk about was, the tax rate on a certain thing, or, potholes on the county roads, or whatever it was that they're passionate about. City council races, same thing, right? That's a relatively new thing in our state, and it's not just in Arkansas. This is a national thing, for better or worse, and I think Bill really nails that. The other thing, and we won't talk about it too much because I find that when I talk about it, people go to sleep, is party organization. So party organization, we fixate on the politicians, on those office seekers, right? The partisans who are running for office, and we forget there's a small army of committed, many of them volunteers, who work tirelessly on stuff like voter roll data, voter registration, get out the vote efforts, recruiting efforts. This is really thankless work, okay? We don't notice this work. The Republicans had worked very hard, and I captured it in a study with a colleague. We compared a survey of involvement. It was sort of a battery of questions that had first been asked in 1999, not by me, and we revisited this in 2013. So a lot had happened in that era, and luckily in '99, one of the party organizations that answered the surveys was the Republican Party of Arkansas and the Democratic Party of Arkansas. And so we contacted them again. We asked some other states as well, but I was particularly interested in the Arkansas responses. And what we found on almost every measure in the '99 piece, Democrats were, for the most part, ahead on party organization. If we could find a way to sort of numerically grade them, they were more advanced. Their party organization was more advanced. It wasn't that Republicans weren't working and trying, but they just hadn't had as much time, perhaps. They certainly didn't have the fundraising yet, the money down. And that's kind of the seed of everything in this. And so by 2013, I was struck. We saw that on every metric, Republicans had improved, and in most cases had surpassed Democrats. Not just the dollar amount of fundraising, which was a massive difference as well, but even though the number of staff, the number of volunteers that they could count, that are that close enough into their state party orbit, the active county offices, the fact that Doyle Webb at the time, who was party chair, was paid. The Democratic Party chairperson is still not paid. It's still a position that's elected and previously has been sort of appointed by the governor, who was always a Democrat, right, for a really long time. It was usually a trusted friend or advisor of the governor. David Pryor, who I work in a center after his name, was party chair for a short minute when there was an emergency vacancy in the position. And this was more recently in around 08, 09. So these are almost ceremonial positions. I think Grant Tennille, who's chairing the Democratic Party now, works really hard. It's not a dig at him, but it's not a paid position. You're limiting who you're going to get. Doyle Webb, in 07, 08, when he's thinking about running for this from his party leadership, he says he'll do it if he's paid. It's going to be his full-time job. It's going to be his occupation. He's going to be working too hard. He can't focus on doing another thing and this, right, which is what the Democratic Party chairperson had done. Stuff like that matters. It's measurably, we can compare it to other states when they succeed electorally, politically. You've got to have a party organization to capture these moments like 2010. If the Republican Party wasn't ready in party organization categories to capture people who were, maybe by Obama or the Affordable Care Act or something they had seen on the news, something had mobilized them, as Barr said, had politicized them, right? Had turned them on into politics. Someone needed to be able to answer the phone or the email from the party side to say, yes, and here's a training for candidates. Here's how you file. We're going to get you in touch with a dozen or so people in your county who can help you, right? They're not necessarily going out and recruiting these people, But once they call, there's a network, okay? And that's something the Republicans, for many reasons beyond their own control, just hadn't had access to always. The last thing is brand alignment. I don't have him in here, but Tim Griffin talked about that as well, as did Asa Hutchinson, that for a long time, the Republican Party brand seemed to them to align more with Arkansas voters, the majority of Arkansas voters. So these are the white, moderate to conservative voters who had continued to vote for Democrats by and large for decades. And at some point with the nationalization of politics, we finally see the alignment happen. Asa Hutchinson has a story where you might remember the name Marlon Hawkins out of Conway County. Marlon Hawkins was this openly corrupt sheriff of Conway County. He was liked and reviled. You had to pick one. He wrote a book, came out in the late 80s, early 90s, called How I Stole Elections by Marlon Hawkins. Asa Hutchinson gets a book, gets it, calls a press conference, and I can't find the footage, but according to him, he basically says, he's telling you what he's doing. Almost like, wake up. Why do we keep voting for this?